All right, hello there, thrill seekers. Somebody wanted me to talk about mortality, and I'll do that after 12 seconds of the song I Feel Fine. All right, hello there, thrill seekers. I decided to play a little bit of I Feel Fine by the Beatles because maybe people were worried about me, but basically, right now, for the time being, I feel fine. After the 5 days in the hospital and everything, if you were watching the previous video. Now, somebody who saw that video has asked me to talk about mortality. I hope it was mortality and not morality, because those are two different subjects. I think it was mortality. You know, and the subject of dying and death. And I was trying to think of how to approach this, or if I even could approach this in a short video, because it's kind of a tough subject. But I stumbled across a video that was put up by Dogen Sangha 17 years ago. Now, Dogen Sangha is the group that administers. It was a group started by my teacher, Nishijima Roshi, Guru Nishijima Roshi. And it looks like they had a YouTube channel. Well, they still have a YouTube channel, but it doesn't link to anything else anymore. But the video is called, Death in Buddhism. And if I can figure out how, I'll put one of those in-video links. And if I can't figure out how, you'll just go below this video in YouTube or in Patreon, and you'll be able to see the link there, because I know how to do that. So instead of just putting the video up for you, I thought I would sort of tell you about what's in there, you know, and kind of give my sort of gloss on it, and then we can talk about it a little bit more, because it's at a lecture which looks like it's at the dojo that Nishijima Roshi is established in Chiba Prefecture, and there's a couple of people asking him questions. I recognize both of their voices. One is Peter Roca, who is an Irish guy who's still over there in Japan and still doing Dogen Sangha stuff. And then the other guy's name I've forgotten over the years, but it's the first guy who asks a question, and he was a young Japanese guy, which was unusual because not a lot of young Japanese guys are into Buddhism or into Zen. It's kind of a thing, you know. It's really, when you get into when you go to like a Buddhist group, like not just a temple or something, but a serious sort of study Buddhist group, you almost always find older men, almost exclusively, and then a smattering, if the thing is done in English, of younger foreigners. And I was one of those younger foreigners. I was in my 30s when I first started studying with Nishijima Roshi. But anyway, the first question comes from that young Japanese guy, and he's talking about he's at a university, and somebody he knew who was only 51 years old at the time died suddenly, and I guess it wasn't somebody he knew very well, but he said, in general, almost all religions have an opinion about the death of people, about death. In Buddhism, what is the deal with death? How do you explain death? He didn't say what is the deal. And Nishijima Roshi answers, in Buddhism, death is a state at the present moment. So even though people usually think that when we are living we are happy, and when we have died it is very sad, Buddhism thinks that life and death are just the state at the present moment. Therefore, when I am living, now I am living, now I am living, now I am living, and such a condition continues, and then if I die, then I'm dead, I'm dead, I'm dead, and that condition continues. So according to Buddhist theory, we do not love life so much, and we do not fear death so much. When we are living, we enjoy living, and when we die, we enjoy dying. So the Japanese guy asks a follow-up question, in what way can we enjoy dying? And Nishijima Roshi says, because if you say that life is always happy or pleasant, that's not exactly true, because I can tell you after 5 days in the hospital, that's definitely not always true. And then, you know, the converse, that death is always sad, is maybe not true either. And he gives this example. He says that when he was younger, he used to be a track runner. That's kind of part of Nishijima Roshi's story. He first got interested in practicing Zazen because of a feeling that he found when he was doing long-distance track running. And I think he was in high school. He might have continued when he was in university. I'm not really sure. But he says, and thinking about the existence of a goal, we always talk about goalless practice and such, but here he's talking about the finish line when you're running a track thing, or maybe the amount of laps you've decided to do, whatever it is, you're going to have some kind of finish there. He says the runner can run to a goal. But if there is no goal, I have to continue running endlessly. This would be a very serious condition. Therefore, fortunately, we have an end to life, and that is entering the goal. So in this situation, the existence of death is a kind of benevolent condition. The fact is death. And I remember having a conversation with Nishijima Roshi about somebody who had died. I can't remember who it was. But I said, what do you think death feels like? And he said something like, I think death is a kind of relief. And he kind of went on to say that you have a lot of things you have to do and a kind of burden that you're taking on by being alive. But death, when it finally comes, is, he thinks, for most people, a kind of relief. And I've heard other people say this too. Nisargadatta Maharaj says that when we look at somebody who's dying, we may get distressed and feel like, oh my God, that person is in terrible condition and it's an awful thing. But that the actual subjective experience of it is usually not so unpleasant at all. Now, how do they know this? Well, these are questions that are hard to answer, but I kind of feel that doing loads of Zazen practice has given me a little bit of an insight into this as well. Not that, I have a perfect understanding of what a dying person feels like, but that I've talked a little bit about after my father died a couple of years ago, how I felt that there was some kind of communication going on. I know this sounds spooky and weird, and I don't like saying this stuff because I think maybe it gets into the woo-woo area, but there's this kind of sense that you can get over this, and I guess my point here is to say I think Nishijima Roshi is right. I think probably for the person dying, the experience of death is mostly like, oh my God, this is great. This is finally get to go past all of this. Now, the final question in the video comes from my friend Peter Roca, who I said is still there in Japan, and he still, I believe, does the Dogen Sangha things in either Chiba or Tokyo. I'm not sure. He says, if someone dies, we can assume that the universe continues, but for the person who dies, the universe no longer exists. And Nishijima Roshi, it's funny, he's a little bit of a contrarian guy, because there are times I had heard him say kind of almost that. But when somebody comes at him with that as a question, he doesn't answer that way. He answers differently. He says, if we use a simile of foam on a river, sometimes foam appears on the surface of the river and flows for a while, and then it breaks down. In such a situation, the foam comes back to the water of the river. So both exist, but the foam has vanished. So the foam has vanished as an individual thing, as something we can pick out and go, oh, look, there's a bubble there, there's a bubble there, there's a bubble there, whatever, You could number the bubbles, you could name the bubbles if you wanted to, but after a while they disappear and you can't find them anymore. And he says both exist, though. Both exist, meaning, I think here, he's saying that what we saw initially as foam or a bubble is still there. We just can't pick it out from the river anymore. That is the human life, I think. Therefore, the water really exists, however, the foam disappears and doesn't appear again. So the simile of a foam is a rather good explanation of human life. And I do like that one because we tend to think of ourselves as autonomous individuals because of the way we operate in the world. We seem to be able to kind of do things on our own, and we seem to be fully independent of everything else. Right now, My sister-in-law's dog, Fico, is staring at me because he doesn't understand why I'm talking into nowhere, probably. So I feel like I'm separate from Fico. But the real truth of the matter is there is one self, there is one something, and self is the word that Dogen tends to use for that something. And like I said in my previous videos, it's the same self looking out from my eyes and looking out from Fico Dog's eyes and looking out from Ziggy's over there somewhere, looking out from Ziggy's eyes and my wife who's in the kitchen's eyes, and everybody's, it's an expression of the same thing. So at the time of death, the foam kind of goes back into the river, and maybe at some point a little farther down the river, another bubble appears, and you might say that bubble that appears in the farther down the river is somehow related to the one that we just saw before, but it isn't the same. It isn't the same bubble. It's still made of the same thing. This is the kind of Buddhist way of looking at this sort of stuff. And one of the best places, if you want to kind of get Dogen's take on it and you don't want to spend a lot of time reading it, it appears in book 4 of Shobo Genzo. And I believe I covered this also, pretty sure I covered it in my book, what's it called? It Came from Beyond Zen. I should probably check that and make sure. Hi, Editor Brad here, and yes, I do talk about Dogen's Shoji chapter in my book, It Came from Beyond Zen, in a chapter called He Not Busy Being Born is Busy Dying, which is a Bob Dylan quote. But anyway, it is a chapter called Shoji. And the two characters, if you're interested in such things, mean life and death. So the first character means life. Sometimes it's also used to mean birth, and the second character means death. Together you pronounce it shoji. The first one would actually be pronounced independently as sho, but the second one, if you took it away from the compound, would be pronounced shi instead of ji. It's also one of the reasons that Japanese people are reluctant to use the word shichi, which is 7, because it sounds a little bit like shi, like to die. And the other one they don't like to use is just the shi, which means 4. They tend to Okay, if you want to get really complicated in Japanese, there is a Chinese numbering system which the Japanese use most of the time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's slightly pronounced differently in Chinese. But when they come to the words 4 and 7, because they have that shi syllable that sounds like death, they'll tend to use an older Japanese one, which is yon for 4 and nana for 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There you go. Now you learned something. But anyway, we have this chapter Shoji, and Shoji is also the Chinese-Japanese way of expressing the word samsara. So I didn't understand this, and actually Nishijima Roshi fails to note this in his introduction. So it took me a long time to figure out, because he keeps contrasting life and death with nirvana. So he's actually contrasting samsara with nirvana. And if this samsara nirvana thing gets kind of complicated. When I first came across it, I thought nirvana was like Buddhist heaven, because I didn't know what I was looking at. And then samsara I didn't really get. It's not exactly Buddhist hell, but it's sort of like this world of life and death. And Dogen in here makes a big point of saying there is no difference between samsara and nirvana. There's no difference between life and death and the sacred life of Buddha or nirvana, or the kind of ultimate state. And if we look at this, we can kind of find almost what Nishijima Roshi is quoting, probably from memory here. He says, "To understand that we move from birth to death is a mistake. Birth is a state at one moment. It already has a past and will have a future. For this reason, it is said in the Buddha Dharma that appearance is just non-appearance." And Nishijima Roshi, in his footnote, clarifies that by saying non-appearance could also be understood as simultaneousness, simultaneity. What does he say? Yeah, simultaneousness is the word he used. So it's something that happens at the same time. So that's what he means by non-appearance. Extinction, or death, also is a state at one moment. It too has a past and a future. This is why it is said that disappearance is just non-disappearance. And the footnote here says non-disappearance also expresses instantaneousness. The moment of the present is independent, so it does not appear from the past and does not disappear into the future. That's a really interesting way of putting it. In the time called life, there is nothing besides life. In the time called death, there is nothing besides death. Thus, when life comes, it is just life, and when death comes, it is just death. Do not say, confronting them, that you will serve them, and do not wish for them. So saying that you will serve them is to be overly excited about life, or maybe overly terrified of death, and then wishing for them. You don't wish to die. Nishijima Roshi was an interesting fellow, because I first met him when he was in his 80s. And I remember he would say things like, I am always improving, with a smile. And now that I'm getting older, I'm like, oh God, am I always improving? But I like his attitude, and I really do try to, cop his attitude, as we hippies would have said. I'm not a hippie, but I try to have that attitude too, that I'm always improving. I don't know. There's always some aspect of what's going on that I can look towards and say, okay, that's an improvement, even if something else is not an improvement. And fearing death is one of the things we all fear death. I don't think there's really any exceptions to that. There are people I know out there who like to come on and say, I've overcome the fear of death. And I feel like you can overcome, if what you mean by overcoming the fear of death is overcoming that persistent, like, oh my God, I'm going to die, it's so depressing, I'm so sad, I'm upset, and blah, 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 and kind of making it a heavy thing. Yes, you can overcome that. But I think at some level, there is kind of built into us you want to avoid dying, because you're an animal in one sense, and animals want to have a self-preservation instinct. So you can't overcome that. I had this funny conversation with a guy at Benedictushof, where I lead retreats almost every year in Germany. And it was the guy who established the place. His name was Williges Jäger. And he was a Benedictine monk who started getting into Zen, and then he's established this place in an old Benedictine monastery, which they practice Zen. Along with a little bit of the Benedictine tradition, but I think mostly Zen tradition. And he was in his 90s at the time, and we were having this little conversation, and he said, you would think that when you're as old as I am, he was like 92 or 93, you would be prepared to die, but that's not how I feel at all. So you have that, but I also don't get the impression that he was quaking in his boots over death. It's just that here we are in this moment, and I'm alive, and maybe in a future moment things get worse. I think about when I was in the hospital. Before I went to the hospital, things were going pretty good. I was pretty happy. I was scheduled to get this stone out, and everything was going to happen. But then the stone decided to get stuck and cause a bad infection, and I had to go to the hospital and have all this stuff done, and it was miserable. And, I could have sat around before that happened being like, maybe someday I'll have to go to the hospital and be miserable. But that's no way to live. So it's best to just enjoy life as it is at the moment that you have it. And then, you have to make some sort of accommodations to the future. You want to stay healthy. I go to the gym, every 3 times a week and stuff, and try to eat right and all that stuff. You make some accommodations towards trying to have a decent future, but you can't get too worried about it, or you just drive yourself crazy for no reason. So just enjoy life when you're alive, and then at some point it's going to all be over, and probably, as Nishijima Roshi implied in Nisargadatta Maharaj pretty much stated, maybe that's not so bad. It's just it's the end of the marathon. It's a time to rest, and who knows? Maybe, the bubble comes back in some form, but nothing ever kind of leaves. It's not like everything just blips out of existence for you. I don't think that's the case at all. But there you go. That's the thing that Nishijima Roshi said, and I thought I'd talk about it. Okay, if you want to donate to me talking about more stuff like this or buying more goofy neon green Godzilla t-shirts, Godzilla fans you'll get them really mad if you call Godzilla green. Like, Godzilla's not green! Which ignores the fact that in some of his stuff he is green. Like, he's pretty green in King Kong versus Godzilla, and then some of the comic books and whatever. And he was green on this t-shirt. So anyway, if you want to donate to me buying more green Godzilla t-shirts and other things and, paying for what I have to pay for, you can go to the URL that you're about to see on the screen below, or you're about to hear if you're listening to the audio version, which is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is hardcorezen.info/donate. That's where you can find links to my PayPal and Patreon accounts, and those are my main and usually only ways of making a living, so I appreciate your support. But as always, you don't gotta support me if you don't want to support me. All right, we will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Bye. All right, there's my sister-in-law's dog, Fico. They're real estate agents, and they named him Fico because it sounds like Fido. And he's sitting on the couch, and we're minding him today for them. And there's Ziggy. So you got a double dog cameo today. All right, Ziggy and Fico, we'll see you later. Bye.